Now, I have some breaking news that I need to share with you regarding the Nancy Guthrie case. This is somewhat of a last-minute episode that I'm putting together because of some critical information that I've been able to confirm involving DNA evidence. This is significant, and I wanted to get this information out to you as quickly as possible because I think it represents a potentially major development in this investigation that we've been following so closely here at Crime Case Studio. Let me read this exactly as I received it from my source, because I want to make sure I get the details right and don't misrepresent anything. Some DNA evidence from Nancy Guthrie's home has been sent to the FBI's laboratory for advanced analysis. Now, what makes this particularly interesting is that I'm told the evidence includes hairs that were found inside Guthrie's home. This is a really interesting development, and here's why this matters so much. We haven't known in the past that some of the evidence they are testing for DNA has included hairs. This is new information that we're learning about the case, and it opens up some really intriguing possibilities about where this investigation might be heading. What's also important to understand here is that this development comes after evidence has already been tested through a Florida laboratory that the Pima County Sheriff's Office regularly uses for their forensic analysis. So essentially, what we're looking at here is that hairs that have been found inside Nancy Guthrie's home are now being sent for testing to the FBI after they've already been sent to this Florida lab. Now, this raises an obvious question that I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves right now. Why would they need to send this evidence to the FBI lab if it's already been sent to the Florida lab? What's the purpose of this second round of testing? Is this just standard procedure? Or does this indicate something more significant about the nature of the evidence they're dealing with? The answer to why this evidence is being sent to the FBI is actually very interesting. And I'm going to explain it because understanding the technology and procedures involved is crucial to understanding why this could be such a significant development. Now, before we get into the technical aspects, I want to share with you that Pima County Sheriff's Department has put out an official statement regarding this new reporting. This is what they said, and I'm going to read it word for word. Pima County Sheriff's Department has worked with the FBI since the beginning of the Guthrie investigation. This is not new information. The private lab we utilize in Florida continues to share information with the FBI lab and other partner labs across the country. DNA analysis remains ongoing. Now, there are a few things I want to point out about this statement. First, they're emphasizing that working with the FBI is not new in this case. They've been collaborating since the beginning of the investigation. That's important context to have. Second, they mention that the Florida lab is sharing information with the FBI lab and other partner labs across the country. This part is really significant, and it ties into something we need to remember about this case. They've been having issues with some of the DNA evidence being mixed, meaning it contains genetic material from multiple people. Separating out mixed DNA can be an extremely complicated process. It's not like what you see on TV crime shows where they just run something through a computer and get an immediate answer. This is painstaking, highly technical work that requires specialized knowledge and often specialized equipment. So when they say other partner labs across the country, what they're referring to is the fact that different labs may have different technologies available to them. Some labs might specialize in certain types of analysis or have equipment that other labs don't have. The FBI lab, in particular, often has access to cutting-edge technology that might not be available at private labs or even at many state crime labs. This is exactly why this evidence is now being sent out to the FBI for testing. They may have specific capabilities that the Florida lab doesn't have, or they may be able to approach the analysis from a different angle that could yield better results. But what I really want to focus on here is the fact that we're talking about hairs. The hairs in particular are what's really interesting to me about this development. The question of whether hair evidence can solve this case is not as straightforward as you might think. Hair evidence has evolved significantly over the years in terms of what we can do with it forensically. There have been major technological advances that have changed what's possible when it comes to extracting DNA from hair samples, and understanding these advances is crucial to understanding why this development might be so significant. Before we dive deeper into the technical aspects, I think it's important to step back and consider what finding hair evidence in Nancy Guthrie's home might mean. On the one hand, you could say, well, of course there's going to be hair in her home. She lived there. Her family members visited. People come and go from any home all the time. And that's absolutely true. That's a very valid point, and it's something we need to keep in mind as we discuss this. But on the other hand, depending on where these hairs were found, whose hair it turns out to be, and what the DNA analysis reveals, this could potentially be a game-changing piece of evidence. If they can extract a viable DNA profile from these hairs, and if that DNA profile doesn't match Nancy, her family members, or any known visitors to her home, then we could be looking at evidence that directly links to her kidnapper or kidnappers. Now, let me explain what's so revolutionary about what's happening with hair evidence analysis right now, because this is really important to understand. I've been really hoping that investigators in this case might have some hair to work with because of the more recent advancements in the field. Hair absolutely can make a case solvable in ways that weren't possible even just a few years ago. So I'm actually really excited to hear this news, and the fact that they've sent it to the FBI is particularly interesting. The FBI doesn't have the in-house technology to extract SNPs from rootless hair, which I'll explain in a moment. And I'm assuming we're talking about rootless hair here because if these hairs had roots attached, it would be really quite straightforward to analyze them, and the lab in Florida would have already done that work. If they had successfully extracted DNA from rooted hairs, we might already know the results, and potentially the case might already be solved. So this is very likely rootless hair, or what forensic scientists call a hair shaft, which until very recently we were all told did not contain any useful DNA for forensics or for this type of analysis. This was just accepted wisdom in the field for many years. If you found hair without roots at a crime scene, you could possibly get some limited information from it, but it wasn't considered particularly valuable for DNA analysis. But that has changed dramatically in recent years. The FBI regularly works with specialized companies and laboratories that have developed cutting-edge technology for extracting DNA from rootless hair. One of the pioneering companies in this field is Othram Forensics, and there's also groundbreaking work being done at UC Santa Cruz by Dr. Ed Green and his team. Dr. Green is absolutely brilliant, and he's one of those scientists who proved everyone else wrong when he was able to refine a technology to extract SNP profiles from rootless hair. Let me explain what SNPs are for those who might not be familiar with the term. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. These are variations in our DNA that make each of us unique. When scientists can extract SNPs from hair shafts, they can potentially create a DNA profile that can be used for genetic genealogy, which is the technique that's been used to solve many high-profile cold cases in recent years. What's remarkable is that this technology has been used to help solve numerous cases that only had rootless hair as physical evidence. We're talking about cases where there was no other DNA evidence available. No blood, no saliva, no semen, nothing but hair without roots attached. And there are many, many more cases that have been solved and are currently in the process of being solved using this technology. So this technology opens up many thousands of cases for potentially being able to finally be solved that don't have any other type of DNA evidence available. I've talked about this possibility when discussing the Nancy Guthrie case before. I've mentioned that I was hoping there might be the opportunity to find some hair evidence. Now we just have to hope that it is hair from the person or persons who kidnapped Nancy, and not from some innocent source. Now, let me make sure this is completely clear. Before this technology existed, when hair was found that didn't have the root attached, it was basically deemed to not really be that useful for DNA analysis, and that has now fundamentally changed. Yes, exactly. You could get mitochondrial DNA from rootless hair, and that's been possible for quite some time. But mitochondrial DNA can be good for helping to rule people out as suspects or as sources of evidence. It's not so good for ruling people in or positively identifying someone, because so many people share the same mitochondrial DNA profile. You see, mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line without recombination, which means all of your siblings share it. Your mother shares it. Your maternal grandmother shares it. All of your mother's siblings share it. All of their children share it, and so on. So you can have thousands of people walking around who share the same mitochondrial DNA profile. Because of this limitation, rootless hair was kept in many of these cases, fortunately. But it often wasn't analyzed for DNA because there wasn't really anything useful you could do with it genetically. Now, investigators might have looked at it microscopically to see if it was consistent with the suspect's hair or the victim's hair, for instance. They could look at color, texture, thickness, and other physical characteristics. But there wasn't really any type of DNA analysis that could give you the kind of individual identification you'd want for solving a case. But that's changed dramatically over the last couple of years. Really, just the last few years, with innovations from scientists like Dr. Ed Green and his great team, as well as the work being done at Othram Forensics and other cutting-edge labs. And the FBI has started regularly using these technologies. They used them in the Gilgo Beach murder case, and that is one of the things that helped them zero in on Rex Heuermann as a suspect. There actually hasn't been a lot of public discussion about that particular aspect of the case. But it was really important because they set a legal precedent there when the judge allowed that evidence to be entered, or was going to allow it to be presented as evidence in the trial. So it's something that the FBI would have known immediately was very valuable if they have rootless hair in the Nancy Guthrie case. Now, I'm a little surprised the evidence didn't go directly to one of these specialized labs like Othram, but it makes sense perhaps that it would go to the FBI first, and then to a specialized contractor. The FBI might have some processing they want to do first, some preliminary analysis, or they might want to evaluate the evidence before making the decision to invest in the more expensive and time-consuming rootless hair analysis. Now, I want to address the elephant in the room here, because I'm sure many of you are thinking about this. I'm just thinking about the reality of hair being found in someone's house. Isn't there a good chance this could be Nancy's own hair? Or this could be a family member's hair? Or anybody's hair from someone who was legitimately in the house and maybe not the suspect at all? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a concern, and we need to be realistic about this. It's kind of a Hail Mary at this point in the investigation. Everything is getting to that point because so much time has gone by since Nancy disappeared. We're at a point where investigators are likely looking at every possible piece of evidence, even if it's not a sure thing. But you just never know what that one little piece of evidence is that can break a case wide open. Cases have been solved by the most unlikely pieces of evidence, things that seemed insignificant at first but turned out to be the key to everything. So we can just hold out hope that this hair is going to be from an unknown male that they aren't able to trace to being in that home for any legitimate reason. And sometimes, you don't even know initially if the hair is from a male or female. I mean, you don't really know unless it's very long and has obviously been dyed or styled in a way that might suggest gender. But even that can be misleading. Like in the Gilgo Beach murder cases, some of those hairs they analyzed traced back to Rex Heuermann's wife and his daughter. So they have to actually process the hair and analyze the DNA to determine, is it male or female, and more importantly, whose is it? Now, when evidence like this is being sent around to different labs, they would have to actually send the physical hair to a specialized laboratory, because they are the ones that have that capability to extract that DNA from the hair shaft. It's not something that most labs can do. The equipment and the methodology are very specialized. DNA Labs International, which is the Florida lab that Pima County has been working on developing their own capabilities for rootless hair analysis for a long time. They're trying to develop their own capabilities in this area. However, there haven't been many publicly known, successfully solved cases coming from rootless hair analysis coming out of their lab yet. It may be something that they are hoping to be able to do successfully in this particular case. What's interesting is that DNA Labs International and other labs are working very hard on working with hair shafts, not only for SNPs, which is what I was talking about earlier, but also for STRs. This would be a huge breakthrough if they can successfully do it on a consistent basis. Let me explain what STRs are because this is important. STR stands for Short Tandem Repeat. This is the type of DNA analysis that creates what's called a CODIS profile. CODIS is the Combined DNA Index System, which is the FBI's database of DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and crime scene evidence. STR analysis is the court-admissible standard law enforcement DNA profile that has been used for many, many years, for decades, actually. The advantage of STRs over SNPs is that if you get an STR profile from evidence, you can immediately run it through CODIS and see if there's a match to someone already in the system. With SNPs, you typically use them for genetic genealogy, which is a more complex and time-consuming process, though it can identify people who aren't in any criminal database. So, being able to extract STRs from rootless hair, that has yet to be accomplished successfully on a reliable, repeatable basis. And that is something that many labs are working toward right now. It's kind of the holy grail of hair analysis, because if you could get STRs from rootless hair, you could potentially solve cases much more quickly. Now, I'm trying to think through all the possibilities here, because we only have vague information about what's actually going on behind the scenes. Is it possible that this is not rootless hair, that this is DNA from regular hair with roots attached, and they're trying to do genetic genealogy, and that's why it would go to the FBI? That doesn't really make sense when you think about it critically. If the hair had a root attached, that's a very standard type of analysis. It would not be mixed DNA. It would be a single source profile from that root. Hair roots contain nuclear DNA, which is exactly what you want for identification purposes. And there wouldn't be a reason they wouldn't have already started genetic genealogy through DNA Labs International, if that were the case. DNA Labs International has their own program to do genetic genealogy. They have the capability, they have experienced genealogists on staff, and they've worked on numerous cases. If there had been a hair found with a root that traced back to an unknown male in that home, I suspect this case would already be solved, or at least we'd be much further along in the investigation than we appear to be. So that leads me to believe it's much more likely we're dealing with rootless hair. Otherwise, it just would have stayed in that lab in Florida for analysis. There would be no need to send it to the FBI or to any specialized lab. Now, remember we heard earlier that there was DNA that was mixed from inside the home, and that was one of the challenges that they were having in this case. How does this new piece of information about hair evidence fit into that? Well, if they have hairs, especially rootless hairs, that's not mixed DNA. Hair from a single person, whether it has a root or not, is generally going to be a single source sample. Now, it might be contaminated on the outside. This is seen a lot with rootless hair because it's been lying around, maybe on a floor or in bedding or wherever it was found. Oftentimes, it does have contamination on the outside from other sources. But here's the good news. Labs are able to clean that contamination off and get past it to the DNA of the person who actually had that hair on their head. There are protocols for cleaning hair samples, and the labs that specialize in rootless hair analysis are very good at this. So the mixed sample that we heard about earlier would just be a completely different sample from a completely different piece of evidence. These are two separate things we're talking about. This is exactly what I've been talking about for a while now. This was the hope, that they had dozens or maybe even hundreds of other pieces of evidence that they were processing, or maybe went back and found after the first round of DNA collection. Because that mixed sample we heard about? That's going to take some time to analyze and separate out, clearly based on what we've heard from the Sheriff's Department. And so the hope was that there might be something else that would pop up in this case that could be a faster pathway toward identifying the person or persons responsible. So these are two completely separate things. We've got the mixed DNA sample from some source in the home, and then we've got these hairs, which are a different type of evidence entirely. These are different items that they found. We've got the hair, and then something else that contains mixed DNA. And that mixed DNA is more likely going to be something like what forensic scientists call transfer DNA. This could be from something like a doorknob that multiple people have touched, or maybe a bedsheet, something like that, perhaps in her bedding. You wouldn't necessarily think there'd be a lot of mixed DNA there, but you never know. Does she do her own laundry? Does she have a house cleaner who handles the bedding? Does she have family members who visit and might sit on the bed? That type of thing. So the reality is that this hair evidence is potentially more promising than the mixed sample, if they really do have rootless hair, and if it is from the person who kidnapped Nancy. Then this could be the piece of evidence that will solve the case. This could be the breakthrough everyone has been waiting for. Now, the question that many people are probably asking is, does rootless hair take a long time to analyze? What kind of timeline are we looking at here? Generally, yes, it does take quite a while. The typical experience is it can take a number of months, sometimes quite a few months. Now, investigators would likely push this to the top of the priority list because it's still what forensic experts call a hot case, meaning it's recent and actively being investigated, versus many of the cases where rootless hair analysis is being used that are decades-old, cold cases. So hopefully the timeline will be quicker than the typical experience has been, but realistically, it can take many, many months to get results back. And I want to be honest with you about this. Sometimes it takes multiple tries. The first couple times they attempt the extraction, they just don't get anything useful, or they don't get a viable profile, or they don't get enough of the snips out of it to work with, and they have to keep trying different techniques or different portions of the hair shaft. Eventually, in many cases, they are able to get a usable profile, but it's not always a quick or straightforward process. This is still relatively new technology, and while it's gotten much better and more reliable over the past few years, it's not foolproof. Some hair samples just have more DNA available than others, and some are more degraded than others, depending on environmental conditions and how long they've been there. So who decides when evidence goes to Florida labs, then to FBI, and might go to a couple of different labs? Who's making that decision? It would typically be Pima County Sheriff's Department making that decision since it's their case. But once the FBI becomes involved in a case, things can really change in terms of the decision-making process and the resources available. So it depends on who is in charge of this particular piece of evidence. If it's the FBI who has taken the lead on the hair evidence, it's very likely it will go to Othram or to one of the other labs they regularly work with, because they have established relationships with these labs. They work with them so successfully and so often that they have streamlined procedures in place. If it is up to Pima County to make the decision, it may go back to DNA Labs International to try to extract that SNP profile from the rootless hair. And maybe they're even working on trying to get an STR profile out of it, using their developing techniques. They might want to try their own methods first before sending it out to one of the more expensive, specialized labs. But overall, this is genuinely positive news. It's really exciting, actually. I don't want to get everyone's hopes up too much because we've hit so many brick walls in this case already. There have been so many disappointments and dead ends, but this is the first genuinely positive thing we've heard in quite a while. So let's just keep all our fingers crossed that this hair isn't from a known visitor to her home, or one of the family members, or Nancy herself. And if it's from an unknown person, it really could help push this case across the finish line. Now, one more thing I want to address is whether the color of the hair matters. Does the color of the hair make a difference in the analysis? Well, the FBI may very well be looking at physical characteristics like that before they invest in the rootless hair technology, because it is still relatively new and very expensive. We're talking about thousands and thousands of dollars per sample. And while investigators are certainly willing to spend significant money on this case, it's a high-profile missing person case that has gotten national attention. They don't want to waste resources unnecessarily. If it turns out to be Nancy's hair, after spending all that money on advanced analysis, they will have wasted thousands and thousands of dollars and precious time that could have been used on other evidence. So it should be pretty obvious whether it's her hair or not. We know what her hair looked like. We know the color. We can see it in photographs. You know, if there's gray in it, if it's brown and gray, if it matches her length and color and texture, then it may not be something worth pursuing with expensive testing. But if it's a completely different color and length than Nancy's hair, then they would likely move forward and invest in that analysis, and invest the time to get that done. They might also look at whether it's consistent with any family members who regularly visited the home. There's one more important thing about hair characteristics that's worth mentioning. What forensic scientists have learned from labs that were trying to develop this type of analysis, and DNA Labs International was one of them, way back when this technology was first being developed, is that when hair is dyed, it can interfere with the DNA extraction process. So, since we're talking about color, dyed hair can potentially interfere with the process in some cases. The chemical process of dyeing hair can actually damage the DNA or make it harder to extract. And some people have a lot more DNA in their hair shaft than others. So it's not automatic that every hair sample is going to yield a good DNA profile. This is fascinating when you think about it. DNA Labs International, way back in 2019, was testing hair from different people in their lab as they were developing their techniques, and they were surprised to find that they weren't able to necessarily predict whose hair would be the most DNA-rich. They thought maybe younger people would have more DNA, or people with certain hair colors or textures, but it didn't always work out the way they expected. Whether that's changed because those were early techniques and things have now been refined significantly is unclear. But it was interesting to learn about at the time. It's really exciting when we see these innovations and we see these possibilities opening up for solving cases that didn't exist before. So just to make this completely clear, rootless hair is not all the same. One hair could have more DNA on it than another, and if someone had dyed their hair, that could affect the quality and quantity of DNA that can be extracted. The DNA is in the hair shaft, and the chemical process of dyeing can potentially damage that DNA. But this information comes from several years ago when the technology was first being developed. It's entirely possible that labs have now dealt with that challenge and gotten beyond it. Science advances quickly in this field. There definitely are some hair samples that are more challenging to extract a usable DNA profile from than others. So we just have to keep our fingers crossed and wish the investigators and the lab technicians luck, and hope this finally brings Nancy home to her family. I really appreciate all of you for being here and for caring about this case. The world of forensic DNA analysis is incredibly complex, and being able to break it down and explain it in terms that we can all understand is so important. And at the end of the day, what experts have said over and over again is that it could very well be DNA evidence that breaks this case wide open. It really could be. We've seen it happen in so many cases in recent years. Cases that were cold for decades have been solved because of advances in DNA technology and because of the persistence of investigators who never gave up. I appreciate you guys for checking out Crime Case Studio again. I know I kind of just threw this one together at the last minute, but when I got this information, I felt it was important enough that I needed to get it out to you as quickly as possible. I told you guys yesterday that my mom had shoulder surgery, so I'm helping her out right now with her recovery. I'll be back in Arizona soon, though. I'll be back just pounding the pavement soon, following up on leads and continuing to investigate this case. But I just hope that this development represents a genuine step in the right direction. I hope this hair evidence, if it's analyzed successfully, and if it belongs to someone who shouldn't have been in Nancy's home, can finally provide the breakthrough that this case desperately needs. I hope for Nancy Guthrie herself, wherever she is, and for her family, especially for her loved ones who have been living with this nightmare, that there can finally be some resolution in this case sometime soon. No family should have to live with this kind of uncertainty and anguish. The hope is that they can sort out the DNA evidence and resolve the DNA issues that have apparently been slowing down the investigation. DNA analysis is not always as quick or as straightforward as we'd like it to be, especially when you're dealing with complex samples or mixed DNA or degraded evidence. But the technology keeps getting better, and the experts keep getting more skilled at extracting information from even the most challenging samples. The fact that the FBI is now involved with this hair evidence, the fact that it may be going to some of the most advanced labs in the country, that gives us hope. These labs have solved cases that seemed completely unsolvable just a few years ago. They've identified victims and perpetrators from the smallest traces of DNA. They've built family trees that have led investigators directly to people who thought they'd gotten away with crimes committed decades ago. What we've learned about rootless hair analysis is truly revolutionary. For decades, if you found hair at a crime scene without the root attached, it was considered to have very limited forensic value. You could look at it under a microscope, you could compare physical characteristics, you could maybe get mitochondrial DNA that could eliminate some people, but couldn't positively identify anyone. But now, with these new techniques for extracting SNPs from hair shafts, suddenly thousands and thousands of cases have potential evidence that was previously considered almost worthless. Think about how many crime scenes had hair evidence collected. Think about how many cold cases have evidence boxes sitting in storage with hair samples that were collected but never fully analyzed because the technology didn't exist to get useful information from them. This technological breakthrough is opening up all of those cases for potential resolution. And it's not just murder cases or kidnapping cases. It's sexual assault cases where the perpetrator left hair behind. It's burglary cases. It's all kinds of crimes where hair evidence might have been left behind by the person responsible. The Gilgo Beach case is a perfect example. Rex Heuermann was identified in part because of hair evidence that was analyzed using these advanced techniques. That case had been cold for over a decade, multiple victims, and no clear suspect. And then these new DNA technologies helped investigators finally make the connection and build a case. So what does this mean for Nancy Guthrie's case specifically? Well, we have to be realistic about a few things. First, as we discussed, there's a very real possibility that any hair found in Nancy's home could belong to Nancy herself, to family members, to friends who visited, to service workers who came to the house, to any number of people who had a legitimate reason to be there. But that doesn't mean this evidence isn't valuable. Even if some of the hair belongs to expected sources, if there's even one hair that belongs to an unknown individual, that could be the break in the case that investigators need. And the fact that this evidence is being sent to the FBI suggests that investigators have reason to believe it could be significant. The FBI doesn't get involved in every local missing person case. They don't send evidence to their advanced labs for every piece of hair that's found. The fact that they're doing so here suggests that there's something about this evidence that makes it worth pursuing. Maybe it was found in a location where you wouldn't expect to find hair from just anyone. Maybe the physical characteristics suggest it doesn't belong to Nancy or any known person who should have been in her home. We don't have all the details, and we may not get all the details until there's a break in the case or charges are filed against someone. That's the frustrating part about following these investigations in real time. We get glimpses of what's happening, little pieces of information here and there, but we don't get the full picture. And then there's still the question of that mixed DNA sample that was mentioned earlier. That's a separate piece of evidence that's apparently been challenging to analyze. Mixed DNA samples can be incredibly difficult to work with. If you've got DNA from two people mixed together, or even worse, 3 or more people, separating out the individual profiles is complex. It's not impossible, but it takes time and specialized expertise. Different labs have different technologies for dealing with mixed samples. Some use probabilistic genotyping software that can mathematically separate out the contributors to a mixed sample. Some use other techniques. But it's not always successful, especially if one contributor's DNA is present in a much smaller quantity than another contributor's. So the fact that we've now learned about this hair evidence suggests that maybe investigators decided to pursue other avenues while they continue to work on that mixed sample. Maybe they went back through the evidence that was collected and realized they had hair samples they hadn't fully exploited yet. Maybe they've been waiting for the rootless hair technology to advance to a point where they felt confident in sending samples out for analysis. The question that many people are probably asking is, how long is this going to take? If the hair has now been sent to the FBI, if it then goes to a specialized lab like Othram, how long before we know anything? As I explained earlier, this is not a quick process. We're potentially looking at months, and that's if everything goes well. If the first extraction attempt doesn't work, if they have to try again with different techniques or different portions of the hair, it could take even longer. I know that's frustrating to hear. We all want answers now. Nancy's family desperately wants answers now. But the reality is that good forensic science takes time. You can't rush this kind of analysis without risking errors or contamination or invalid results. And in a case like this, where there may eventually be a prosecution, where evidence may need to hold up in court, everything has to be done meticulously and by the book. Any defense attorney is going to scrutinize every step of the DNA analysis process. They're going to question the chain of custody, the extraction methods, the interpretation of results, everything. So the labs doing this work have to be absolutely certain that they're following proper protocols and that their results are scientifically sound. Cases like this also raise questions about the role of public attention and media coverage. Does public interest help solve cases like Nancy Guthrie's disappearance? I believe it does. When people are paying attention, when there's pressure to find answers, resources get allocated. Tips come in from the public. People who might know something are reminded of the case and might come forward. But there's also a balance that has to be struck. Investigators have to be careful about what information they release publicly. They don't want to compromise their investigation by revealing too much. They don't want to tip off potential suspects about what evidence they have or what they know. They have to protect the integrity of the case. So sometimes we, as members of the public following these cases, have to be patient with the fact that we're not getting every detail. We have to trust that investigators are doing their jobs and pursuing every lead, even if we don't know exactly what they're doing or why. That said, I do think there's value in discussing cases like this publicly and explaining the science and the process. It helps people understand how complex these investigations are. It helps people appreciate the work that goes into solving cases. And it keeps the case in the public consciousness, which can lead to tips and new information. So where does that leave us with the Nancy Guthrie case? I think we have to approach this news with cautious optimism. The fact that hair evidence has been sent to the FBI for advanced analysis is encouraging. It suggests that investigators are actively pursuing new leads and utilizing cutting-edge technology. It suggests they haven't given up on this case. But we also have to be realistic. This evidence might not pan out. It might turn out to be from an innocent source. Even if it's from an unknown person, that person might not be in any database, might not have any genetic relatives who have done ancestry DNA testing, might be impossible to identify through genetic genealogy. Or, on the other hand, this could be the break that solves the case. This could be the piece of evidence that leads investigators directly to the person or persons responsible for Nancy's disappearance. We just don't know yet, and we won't know for quite some time. What we can do is continue to pay attention, continue to share information about the case, continue to hope that Nancy's family will get the answers they deserve. We can trust that the investigators working on this case are doing everything in their power to find the truth, and we can appreciate the incredible advances in forensic science that are making previously unsolvable cases solvable. At the end of the day, behind all of this technical discussion about DNA and SNPs and rootless hair analysis, there's a human being at the center of this case. Nancy Guthrie is a real person with a real family who loves her and misses her and wants to know what happened to her. That's what this is all about. It's easy to get caught up in the fascinating science of it all, in the procedural aspects of the investigation, in the technical details. But we can't lose sight of the fact that this is about finding answers for Nancy and for her family. Every piece of evidence that's tested, every lab that analyzes samples, every investigator who works on this case is working toward that goal of bringing Nancy home and bringing whoever is responsible to justice. So while we wait for results from this DNA testing, while we hope that this hair evidence will provide the breakthrough that's needed, let's remember Nancy. Let's remember that this isn't just a fascinating case study or an interesting application of new technology. This is a real investigation into what happened to a real person. I want to commit to all of you that I will continue to follow this case closely here at Crime Case Studio. As soon as there are any updates, as soon as I hear anything new from my sources or from official channels, I will bring that information to you. I'll continue to consult with experts to help us understand what's happening behind the scenes and what it means for the investigation. If you haven't already, please make sure you're subscribed to Crime Case Studio so you don't miss any updates. This case has captured the attention of people across the country, and I think we all want to see it resolved. We all want Nancy's family to get answers, and if anyone watching has any information about Nancy's disappearance, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Sometimes what seems like a small detail to you might be exactly the piece of information investigators need. Don't assume that what you know isn't important. Let the investigators make that determination. All right, that's it for today's episode here at Crime Case Studio. Thank you again for watching and for caring about this case. Together, we can help keep enough attention on it that the people working on it know that the public is watching and waiting for answers. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you in the next episode.
We're doing this, and I just want to start first with genetic genealogy. Can you kind of break down, just for people at home, what is this?
Genetic genealogy is the combination of using DNA and documentary records to learn more about someone's family tree. Traditionally, we used it to identify long dead ancestors. Everybody has what we call a brick wall in their family tree where they can't get past a certain point in the paper trail or the records. DNA can often help us get over that brick wall and learn more about our distant ancestors. Next, we started using it to help adoptees and people of unknown parentage find their biological families. And now we're using it to help law enforcement identify people from their DNA. We're only allowed to use it for violent crimes or to identify Jane and John Does who died without their identification.
Okay. And we know that this is something that the Pima County Sheriff's Department is looking at when it comes to the Nancy Guthrie case. How long can it take, though, when you have a potential DNA sample and you go through this route of genetic genealogy?
It can take quite a bit of time. Now, fortunately, the sheriff sent the DNA to a private lab that is kind of a one-stop shop. They're great at extracting the DNA from the evidence and then creating two separate profiles. The one that's uploaded to CODIS, the type of profile law enforcement has used for decades, and then the different type of profile that we need for genetic genealogy. And so it will save time to send it there because they were able to create both of those profiles in parallel. So we don't lose time when they don't get a CODIS hit, they can jump right to the genetic genealogy. Once they get that profile created, which is hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genome, I hear it's a mixture in this case, at least one of the samples. So then they have to work with the bioinformatics scientists to separate out that DNA and make sure that they are working on the person of interest DNA. Then once that's done, it's uploaded to the databases that have agreed to work with law enforcement on the genealogy side. Unfortunately, even though there are over 50 million people who have taken direct-to-consumer DNA tests, the top 3 companies have barred law enforcement's use. And so we are limited to the 3 smallest databases, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice. So they will upload that raw data file to those databases where it's compared against everyone in the database that has agreed to work with law enforcement. And so then we get what's called a match list. But our match list is different than CODIS. We are not going to find that exact person. We are looking for relatives, and we can work with second, third, fourth, fifth cousins, and sometimes even beyond that, to reverse engineer the family tree of this person of interest based on who they're sharing DNA with. So the people that show up on that match list are really partial matches. They might only share 1% of their DNA, maybe even less. But that means that they have a common ancestor with that unknown suspect or person of interest. And so our job is to identify who those common ancestors are between the matches, right? Because we know who they are, we can build their family trees. So we're looking for patterns, overlaps, triangulations between the family trees of those individuals. So we're not just working with one match, we're working with a whole network. Often it is possible to go back to her home and do some more swabbing. But as I said, I wasn't there. I don't know how many they gathered, but DNA is hardy. So it's certainly possible. There is still some DNA there. And in particular, I really do think that saliva is the most likely. And that is because of what appeared to be that bite flashlight in his mouth. Yeah. Somebody wrote to me that has used one of those and agreed with me that it would produce a lot of saliva and it would be very difficult not to leave some of that behind.
And I know that you've told me before that sometimes, even light switches or really unassuming places in a home can crack an entire case. It was interesting. Right. Our News Nation's Brian Enton spoke with a key source who said that the supervisor overseeing the case had never previously investigated a homicide before. I mean, you say this comes down a lot of times to experience and the gut of the person going in, surveying that area and taking as many samples as is needed. Does that concern you to hear that they had never investigated a homicide before?
Well, even if he hadn't, I'm sure the crime scene investigators were very experienced and they would be the ones that would be collecting that DNA. And so I still have confidence that those very experienced, skilled crime scene investigators would know, how to collect the DNA. But because, as I said, it's invisible, they may not have swabbed exactly the right thing to find that individual's DNA through no fault of their own, just because it's hard to know in a house like that, where would you even start other than the obvious places?
And investigators already gave the home back to the Guthrie family weeks ago. I mean, could that pose a problem if they go looking for more samples? Or in your opinion, should they still go back and re-swab?
Well, it could, but because they know who has been in that home,
Right.
they can still eliminate those individuals' DNA. So I don't think it's as big of a problem as I've heard a lot of people speaking about. The only issue to me would be more if there was saliva on the ground, for instance, or a rootless hair that could also solve the case. It could have been tracked back out, it could end up on the bottom of someone's shoe. But if there is something that is still on a surface, then I think it's still, possible that they could get that person's DNA if they haven't done that already. Now, of course, this is, a little bit of a Hail Mary, but